Hello and welcome to Trends Research and Advisory. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you, our guests, audience, in this virtual webinar. My name is Awad Al-Breiki, Chief Global Officer at Trends Research and Advisory, and I'm thrilled to be here today to open this discussion with Mr. Bilal Saab. Our talk today will revolve around several issues spanning from insight taken from the new book of Saab titled Rebuilding Arab Defense, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East, to more recent political and security dynamics linked to the current status of U.S.-Arab relationship, with an eye to President Biden Middle East trip. I would like to start by introducing our esteemed guest, Bilal Saab, who is Senior Fellow and the Founding Director of the Defense and Security Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Saab is also an Adjunct Assistant Professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches graduate courses in U.S. defense policy in the Middle East and international security studies. Prior to that, Saab was a former Department of Defense official, where he served as a senior advisor for security cooperation. In his capacity in the Pentagon, he led security cooperation in the broader Middle East and oversight responsibility for U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. Saab's academic papers are published in peer-reviewed journals such as Survival, the Washington Quarterly, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. His commentaries and articles regularly appear in first-class media outlets such as Foreign Affairs, American Interest, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest. Again, I'm very pleased to be joined here today by Bilal Saab, and I have no doubt this will be a great discussion. Before leaving the floor to my colleague, Leonardo Matsuko, a trends researcher, who will moderate this talk, I would like to proceed with a few remarks. Our conversation today takes place at a critical time in U.S.-Arab relationship. During the past years, Washington has made no secret for its interest in gradually softening its security commitment to the region and reducing its military footprint in the Middle East. The U.S. desire to disengage from the Middle East is part of a major readjustment of America's global strategic priorities to tackle what the U.S. is perceived as a rising Chinese threat in the Indo-Pacific theater. The rationalization of its overseas military commitment brings about not only a diminishing presence of U.S. troops and military hardware in the Middle East, but also reduced American interest in devoting further diplomatic and financial resources to solve regional conflicts. As the U.S. is gradually recalibrating its foreign policy compass to serve its new strategic priority better, Washington is called to deal with a heavy legacy in the region and define a new Middle Eastern policy. That's it. At the same time, the Arab Gulf countries have developed a mounting distrust toward America's security guarantees to its regional partner and starting questioning Washington's political will to uphold the current balance of power. Genuine doubts over the future of U.S. involvement in the regional affairs have induced the Arab Gulf countries to look for homegrown defense solutions and alternative partner to fill the security vacuum that the U.S. may leave behind after its pivoting to Asia. Although these choices might not always find Washington's endorsement, the Arab Gulf countries signal their strong commitment to secure the region from a multifaceted array of threats by aligning themselves with whoever is capable of providing them with cutting-edge defense solutions. While the U.S. struggles to shift its national priorities to a new strategic environment, and the Arab partner openly voiced mounting reserve to accept a pre-made solution that do not consider their security interest, President Biden comes to the Middle East aimed what seems to be make it or break it moment in U.S.-Arab ties. With that, I leave the floor to you, Leonardo.
Thank you very much, Awad, for your opening remarks. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Saab for joining us at Trends today. So before commencing our discussion, I must say that Mr. Saab's book is an effective, systematic, and informative analysis that is helpful to all observers of the Middle East who are interested in achieving a better understanding and a more comprehensive picture, not only of what the US has done in the region in terms of security cooperation during the past decades, but also of how the military and the civil structures running the massive US Army machine work and how they have evolved throughout the years. And most importantly, as the title suggests, how the US Army strategic thinking, functioning mechanisms, and culture should be reconfigured to better fit with new America's global priorities and interests. After having said that, as you may expect, Mr. Saab, I would like to share with you my first question that concerns President Biden's visit to the Middle East. So during the past few weeks, much ink has been spent to decipher the main drivers underpinning President Biden's trip, what the regional visit is about and what it is not about. While in an op-ed published in the Washington Post, President Biden said that the trip aims to start a new and more promising chapter of Americans' engagement in the region. It remains kind of difficult to ascertain what issues among the Iranian threat, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and surging oil prices will dominate the discussion between the US president and the Arab heads of state gathering in Jeddah. So President Biden comes to the Middle East with a densely packed agenda and at a delicate time for US-Arab diplomatic ties in the attempt to tame the soaring fuel prices at home and to restore the confidence of America's decades-long Arab partners in Washington's commitment to regional security. So ultimately, my question is, could you please explain us and contextualize President Biden's trip and share with us your understanding, your view, and which are, according to your knowledge of the region and of the administration, the main drivers, the potential opportunities, and the prospective spoilers or challenges to the trip. I give you the floor, Mr. Saab.
That's a lot, Leonardo. It's a heavy question. It's a loaded question, but let me just say a couple things first. First of all, Abdullah, it's good to see you, my friend. And Leonardo, thank you very much for moderating the session. It certainly comes at a very, very important time. And it's a conversation that should be had not just between you and I, but amongst many others who really are trying to figure out really what are the goals of this trip, what could be really accomplished out of this trip, what deliverables could be agreed upon, what promises could be made. And believe it or not, this is one of those trips that raises more questions really than you can find answers to. It is quite an unusual trip. But objectively speaking, also, you have to recognize that the president is not also going to see just a single individual, single leader. He's going to see a set of countries. Not all of them are the same. Obviously, all have different issues, all have different concerns about the United States, all have different capabilities. And so try to imagine, put yourself in the shoes of the president, try to coordinate on all these issues, trying to understand various sets of policies and problems and challenges and opportunities in a single trip is incredibly challenging. And of course, he's got a staff to help him out with all these files and all these issues, across departments. But nevertheless, it's just a lot to handle. And especially at a time that is not normal. It is very abnormal, which means that the political temperature between the president and most Middle Eastern partners, I would say Arab partners, the temperature is very high. The tensions are pretty high. And so add to that, in addition to the objective challenges that he has to deal with especially in light of the conflict in Yemen, the attacks from the Houthis and the Iranians against the Saudis and the Emiratis, at a time when, for the first time in a very long time since Operation Desert Storm in 1990, 1991, you are seeing physical attacks, conventional, by Iran and its proxies against these countries. And so we're having conversations now at a moment that is quite unprecedented. Again, if you go back all the way to 1990, 1991. I will couple that with the fact that the president himself, has sort of cornered himself with some rhetoric that I thought was pretty unnecessary, but frankly quite expected for any politician who's seeking office by just hurling some accusations and some pretty harsh rhetoric against the Saudis, from which now it's going to be incredibly difficult to get out of, right? I mean, now you are reading articles less about the substance of the summit, less about the type of diplomacy that might be conducted at the summit, and more about meaningless things like, is he going to shake hands with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia? I can't remember if it was Bloomberg who wrote about it or someone else. It doesn't matter. But the bottom line is mainstream media in the United States are focusing on the most meaningless things as far as, is there going to be a handshake or not, as opposed to us focusing on the things that matter, that are really now causing a rift between the two sides. So look, if just to sum it up, if you ask me, like, how's my mood? How is my assessment of this trip? A lot of it, I would say the majority of my mood is confusion, because frankly, or lack of clarity, I would say. I just honestly do not know how successful the president is going to be given the immense set of challenges and the very difficult politics that he has to navigate, at least with the key player, which is the Saudis. It's going to be a little bit smoother with the others, whether it's the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, and others. But with the Saudis, the key player, boy, every single movement, every single word that comes out of the president's mouth, every single body language is going to be analyzed and overanalyzed, and understandably so, because of how incredibly problematic this relationship has been since the coming of this administration. So lack of clarity in terms of what's going to be agreed upon, but I'm going to leave that 20% left of optimism and a little bit more excitement, because this administration recognizes that we have now a strategic opportunity to really sort of turn the page and revitalize those very important partnerships that we have in that part of the world, because they're not just important in their own right, they're also important for this broader environment, broader context of strategic competition with China and Russia. When you have partners like that who could play significant roles in this key global priority of yours now, it is incumbent upon you to figure out how do you actually integrate them into this strategic competition. And that's what the president did mention to some extent in the opinion. It's just not just about oil production. It's not just about energy outputs. This is about how do we bring these back to the fore? How do we strengthen those old long-standing partnerships that could be really quite useful to us on a number of levels, not just on oil, but in terms of investments, in terms of Chinese encroachment into the region, certainly Iranian aggression in the region. All of those things we cannot do on our own. There has to be a multilateral framework. And believe me, if there is one core message that the president is going to deliver in the region with the Arabs, it is going to be that together, through integration, which obviously the United States Central Command is going to have to figure out how to execute and how to implement. They already have their initiatives lined up. But through integration, through multilateralism, through greater inclusivity, we can tackle these sets of challenges much more effectively than we've ever have. So let me stop here, Leonardo.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. And exactly on the word integration during the joint press conference between President Biden and Prime Minister Lapid, the word integration featured in President Biden's speech many times. So this, I guess, that is worth noticing, and it tells a lot. So I would like to gradually move to the focus on your book, Rebuilding Arab Defenses, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East. Okay. Starting from the title, your book stresses the need for Arab countries to enter into a structural reform process to rebuild their defense institution, and calls for a significant overhaul of the US approach to security cooperation in the Middle East, but not exclusively in the Middle East. So, and you stated that there had been several recurring moments from the Iran-Iraq War, Desert Storm, and Operation Inherent Resolve that have exposed, on the one hand, the military weaknesses and ineffectiveness on Arab partners on the battlefield and combat operations, as well as the limits of the United States defense assistance programs.
Right.
So could you please explain why you see a need to rebuild Arab defense institution and readjust America's way of doing security cooperation? And since these are not new issues, why have these imperatives become more salient and more meaningful in today's geopolitical context?
Great. That's an excellent question, Leonardo. And we could definitely go back to the issue of integration, because really that explains and that answers your question as to why we need to be more effective as far as generating combat power in the hands of these Arab partners, and why it is now more urgent than ever. Because if you're going to talk about integration now, okay, if you're going to talk about coalition warfare with these countries, they have to first and foremost increase their military capabilities, increase their military effectiveness. Otherwise, what's the point of partnership? I don't want to partner with a weak country. I mean, that gives me really little incentive to do that. What I have to do as the United States is commit to helping you beef up your defenses, strengthen your capabilities, because that way it will be far more attractive to me to partner with you. We have a lot of blame lying on our shoulders as to why we didn't used to do that in the past. Okay, we never focused on that stuff before, and I mentioned that in the book, because there were other priorities at the time, and we had a pretty significant, powerful, dominating military presence in the region where we really didn't need a whole lot of help from anybody, whether it's the Europeans or whether it's the Arabs. And so we did not really have much of a focus or emphasis on helping build the military capabilities of the Arabs. Now, the Arabs themselves had little interest also, because they actually trusted that we would be serving as a guardian to them. We would be helping them not only acquire weapons from us, but also protect them from any danger. And of course, the biggest example is Iran-Iraq war, Operation Desert Storm, expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait, right? And so that to them was, in their minds, the model. Like whenever a major contingency would happen, whenever a major security crisis would take place, they would look to us and say, okay, go ahead and intervene. We'll provide you with what you need in terms of logistics, in terms of access, in terms of money, so we can actually reimburse you, right? But you do the fighting. This proposition has now expired, no more. We have made it clear to everybody who is willing to listen, not just the Arabs, but the Europeans, the Asians, all of our partners across the world, that we are not going to be committed to what, even though I hate the term, endless wars or open-ended wars, especially in the Middle East. And so that means that our partners have to also do some pretty heavy lifting, and they cannot do that unless they improve their own military capabilities, which to me has a core requirement, which doesn't just limit it. It's not just limited to equipment. It's not just limited to hardware, which they have a ton of, by the way. There's a lot of firepower in the Gulf, right? And in Egypt and in Jordan. It is also the necessary accompanying institutional infrastructure that comes with it, which enables you to use these weapons effectively, enables you to sustain these weapons effectively, to think strategically about how you actually use them. All of these things that we take for granted as Western militaries, post-industrialized Western militaries, but in the Arab world, it's almost like they have to start from scratch. Like, how do you actually strategize? How do you plan? How do you conduct planning? How do you do threat-based assessments, strategic analysis? How do you do logistics? How do you actually come up with an acquisition policy that really meets your security requirements as opposed to just ad hoc buying weapons? All of this fabric, this defense foundation, is incredibly deficient in the Arab world. And we owe it to ourselves, we the United States, to help them develop military power the right way, to generate combat power the right way, because we benefit first and foremost from a stronger partner. We're not doing it for charity. We're doing it because we benefit when we have a stronger partner. And as you can imagine, this is going to take a while because it's a difficult process. Building institutions takes a while. It requires changes on multiple levels, on culture, societal, economic, bureaucratic. All of these things have to actually happen in order for the institutional military track to also bear fruit.
Thank you so much. And exactly, on the specific relation between Washington and its Arab partners. Throughout the book, you have clearly highlighted how the states and the Arab friends equally bear the responsibility and the blame for unsatisfactory outcomes of both the U.S. military assistance programs. And you bring up and shed particular light on the cultural element. And there is an entire chapter dedicated to that. So from what you wrote, I understood that in order to have a meaningful US-Arab security cooperation to emerge, they need to find a common way to define how to proceed further, that there is not one-way street, and no party actually can impose its one-sided view on the other and reasonably expect to achieve meaningful, tangible, and enduring results. So could you please expand on this and shed some light on the role that culture has in informing the success or failure of defense institution building programs? And ultimately, what steps could be taken to improve mutual cultural understanding between the states and the Arab partners?
Great, excellent question. Also loaded, and there's a ton of scholarship on this, a lot of good academic work on this. So let me just rely a little bit more on that and then just tie it to the book. There is no question that militaries around the world, I don't care what region you're looking at, I don't care what country you're looking at, all militaries are reflections of their societies, right? There's not just like they're parachuted from some other country, they come from their societies. Therefore, they have certain cultures, certain norms, certain habits that are manifested in society also spill over into the military, okay? And so this culture is extremely important because it shapes pretty much everything as far as military development, as far as modernization, as far as how do you approach the very broad topic of military power, right? Every country is unique. It's got, even though this is the Arab world and there's a lot of things in common in the Arab world as far as political culture, but still every single country in the Arab world is unique in terms of its political system, in terms of its history, in terms of its habits, in terms of its likes and dislikes and capabilities across levels, right? So starting with the major recognition that each country is unique, politically speaking, culturally speaking. Nevertheless, and therefore you have to build an army around that specific culture. Nevertheless, and we have to be very cognizant of that ourselves, which is something that we are very weak at, very poor at in terms of actually understanding really the cultures and the societies of the partners that we work with, right? We are not good at that, which always finds which always ends up, causing a bunch of problems in our military assistance programs. Because we don't understand the institutional capacity of the country. We don't really understand the culture as well. But having said all that, there's a certain set of universal principles when it comes to building military power the right way, okay? I don't care where you're from, what region, these are time-tested, proven, universal principles of military power that no matter where you are, you have to abide by them to actually become an effective military, okay? Whether it's the decentralized command and control, whether it's the jointness, whether it's the empowerment of the younger officers, whether it's allowing them to be more creative on the battlefield, less rigid system, more checks and balances, healthier civil-military relations, you get the advice from the civilians, but the military executes, and so on and so forth. Some Huntingtonian concepts, although these need to be updated in this day and age. A lot has changed since Huntington's book, but those universal principles have to be consulted, have to be considered no matter what your culture is. So the challenge becomes, how do you marry these universal principles that you definitely need with your unique culture? How do you marry the two? How do you make them tailored to your culture? And this is something that every single country every single developing country, I would say, has struggled with. Whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the Middle East, You start first with who you are in terms of a country and its culture and its history and its norms and habits. And then you consult these universal principles on how you actually become an effective military, and you try to tailor them to the extent possible to what you understand best, to what you're most familiar with, to what works really for you best. We as the United States suck at that. We are very bad at that in terms of actually tailoring our military assistance in ways that really make sense to the Arab partner. What we typically end up doing is following our own systems, our own logics, our own processes, our own everything that we do, and try to basically implant it into that country because that's exactly how we know how to do it. And it makes sense in terms of why we do it, because that's what we know. That's how it works in the United States. All of our industry, that's how it works. All of our institutions, that's how they work. And so we sort of almost like plant all of that knowledge and experience into this Arab country, and oftentimes it just doesn't work. Now, we've done much better, obviously. There are always exceptions in places like Lebanon, to some extent in Jordan, in more recent years now, we're starting to do that in Saudi Arabia, right? But this ability of ours to understand the limitations of our partner, to understand the culture and the habits and the norms of our partner and what could be done and what can't be done, and not trying to impose our own ways, will continue to be a challenge, which is why this has to be, as you said yourself, Leonardo, not a one-sided affair. It has to be a collective affair, right? And this is why we talk about relationships. And in a relationship, you're still constantly trying to learn each other and trying to understand, what your ins and outs are. And this process becomes more difficult when the politics at the higher level are messed up. And that's what we've had over the past few years since the coming of the Biden administration. It's that all these military exchanges, all these military relationships have struggled to some extent because at the higher level, the politics were quite tense, the relationships were quite tense, and in many ways it has affected security cooperation on the ground.
Thanks for that. I completely, of course, agree with that point. And having the right, not only signaling, but also sequencing between what has been said and what, promised to deliver and the actual results. Today there is a growing need to say facts and not only words, especially when there are this high level and first profile promises and programs. So moving a bit more on detail on the case studies that you presented on the book, you develop your arguments by presenting 4 main case studies: Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, and the UAE. They are very different countries, and you present very different issues that the US military assistance programs have to deal with when and actually try to figure out how to build more efficient and more combat ready armies over there. And undoubtedly, all these case studies bring to the discussion different added values and shed light on specific domestic related issues. However, I would like to ask you if there is one specific case study that is particularly important or telling in terms of the lessons learned and main implication and generated outcomes. And if yes, if you can talk about it, or if there is no, if you can shed light on achieved lessons from each case study that you talk about.
Well, whoever's watching this, whoever knows me will say obviously that I am biased because I am Lebanese American, but the facts speak for themselves, Leonardo, and the proof is in the pudding. One of the most successful cases of military assistance that we've had, at least over the past decade, is the Lebanese case. And there's a ton of lessons that can be learned from that case in terms of the persistent engagement between our defense specialists that visit the country, engagements with the military leadership in Lebanon, working across initiatives and programs, working really as holistically as possible, developing a certain level of trust that is really remarkable between the two, right? And that is very important, obviously, in terms of any kind of relationship that we have in the region or any kind of security cooperation that goes on. Without trust, the entire enterprise falls apart. But there was a very high level of trust between the two. The Lebanese were very attentive listeners, good students. They never had really lofty asks or laundry lists of equipment that they wanted. And of course they couldn't because they didn't have the money, obviously. So sometimes being poor helps because you really have to be very attentive to the preferences and the constraints of your senior partner, which is the United States. But I loved the persistent engagement, the fact that they actually had a presence for a longer period of times inside the country, engaging with various officers, senior officers, and the commander himself, Joseph Aoun. I would say the Lebanese themselves investment in institutional capacity building and understanding of how important this is, right? So first you have to understand why this really is important. If you don't know, then you just don't know, right? There's a lot of countries in the region that don't do institutional capacity building because frankly, they don't understand its value. They don't understand how it truly directly affects military power and military effectiveness. But the Lebanese do. And they proved how significant those investments were in institutional capacity building when they fought in 2017 against scores of fighters from the Islamic State in the north across the Lebanese-Syrian borders. And so you just saw that investment generate some pretty interesting battlefield successes in 2017 that I have yet to see anywhere else, frankly, in the Arab world. Certainly, it was a smaller type of contingency, and wasn't high level or complex that would include conventional and missile attacks. But at the same time, it was an operation against the Islamic State that featured a good bit of jointness, of combined arms. Feats that very few countries around the world actually can engage in, including in NATO. So look, it's a two-way street, and the relationship was very good between the two. They trusted each other. There was a constant level of communication, a high level of transparency also, right? And a good exchange of information, a lot of realism, right? So, let's just say, for example, if the Lebanese want to create a navy, and we would be very clear about, what would it take to actually do that, what it would take to sustain something like that. And so there was a high level of candidness between the two sides that you see a little bit less of in other countries. So those are some of the lessons that I can remember. I'm pretty sure I've got a few others in the book. But that doesn't mean all the other cases are failures. No, I mean, the reason why I mentioned the Saudis, the reason why I mentioned the Jordanians and the Emiratis is because these four countries, along with the Lebanese, to me have expressed the strongest interest in actually investing in institutional capacity building. I mean, the Saudis are obviously overhauling everything, right? They've started doing that several years ago. And it's a long-term process, of course, but at least they've started that journey. And we're trying to help to the extent possible, even though the politics are messed up right now. So I give them credit for actually starting that journey, which is critical. The Jordanians have been doing this for a longer period of time with us, right? At a sort of pace that is acceptable to both sides because we have fewer personnel in, Jordan working on these issues. And it's obviously a less, I don't want to say less strategic partner, but a smaller country, obviously, than Saudi Arabia. Same for Lebanon. The UAE, quite interested in defense reforms, but the difference between them and these three is that they're actually doing it on their own. They are not doing it with the help of the United States. I mean, they'll get some advice from the Americans, but there is no US presence on the ground to really help them with institutional capacity building. They're trying to do this on their own. And they're doing some good things, but they surely have still a long way to go.
Building exactly on, the two words of trust and realism, in the book you mentioned that shared security interests relatively stable and consistent leadership in defense institutions, and eagerness to research best practices, seek advice from international partners, and build domestic intellectual capital in defense reforms are key enabling factors for stronger defense ties between the United States and its other partners. But I mean, given the severe confidence crisis, the trust deficit in Washington's security commitment to the region, and the growing divergence of priorities between these decades-long partners, how could the United States, in a way, entice or persuade its Arab Gulf friends to buy in what it has to offer? And what incentive, resources, and tools could Washington employ to have these partners jumping on board? And on the other side, what the Arab Gulf countries can gain from budding up with the United States on defense institutional building projects?
Well, let me start with the second part, and it's an easy one. Why they should? Because there's no one like the United States that does this better. No one more capable, no one more knowledgeable, no one more qualified to offer that kind of assistance to the Arab partners in terms of institutional capacity building. You have to remember that we are the #1 supplier of arms to these countries. And when you supply this high volume of arms to these countries, there's got to come with it a set of training, exercises, advice on how to use all that stuff, and that you can only get from us. You can't buy a US weapon system and then go to the Chinese or the Russians and say, hey, help me train on these. And so it's a total package approach, which is a term that I don't necessarily like that DSEA uses, but it's not just the weapon. It is actually the weapon that leads to a capability. And only the United States can actually educate you as a junior partner on how you can move from equipment to actually generating combat power. And no one does it better than us. Okay, we had to pay blood. We had to pay a lot of treasure, a lot of embarrassment in the battlefield from 1903 all the way to 1986 with Goldwater Nichols to try to figure out actually how you can fight jointly, how you actually build combat power effectively. So we've been through this for over 80 plus years. And like I said, we fought, we've lost a lot of people because of that. We're trying to basically trial and error. And we were embarrassed in a bunch of places, like in Grenada, like in Desert One, when we tried to rescue some of our own people in Iran. And so this issue of jointness, this issue of generating effective military power, we've been at it for a very long time. And so we have a ton of experience doing that. And if it's not us, then who are you going to go to? The Russians? I mean, just take a look at the military performance of the Russians against Ukraine. If I were in your shoes, I would not be looking at the Russians as the senior partner in terms of military capabilities, in terms of knowledge, in terms of transfer of technology, and so on and so forth. So that's the second part of your question. The first part, which was more about trust, right? Or just help me remember what it was.
It's about, how the United States could entice and the Arab partners from jumping in these, trust deficit times.
Yeah. Look, this really begs an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it, Leonardo, but I myself, including many others who've written about this deteriorating relationship over the past few months and years, I've said that this is really the lowest point, right? Probably worse than when we were at 9/11. But saying that doesn't mean that it's going to be stuck there, or that it's game over, or that there's nothing that could be done really to get things back to where they were, or at least on a more stable trajectory. I'm Arab myself. I know how important it is to, when you invest in certain personal connections with your partner, that it could, I'm not going to say eliminate all the problems or eliminate all the challenges and alleviate all the concerns, but this kind of chemistry, this kind of affinity on a personal level could really go a long way. And we didn't have that for for two administrations over the past 20 years or so. First 8 years with the Obama administration, where there was no personal chemistry whatsoever, which the Arabs really appreciate. Then the Trump administration came in and it was just awkward. It was just awkward. I'm not sure that the Arabs actually really loved that, even though he embraced them and all that. But frankly, he didn't do a whole lot that was very different, practically speaking. And then here comes the Biden administration, which basically kicks it up a notch as far as like offenses and as far as personal insults of certain leaders. And so if that tone changes, if the personal relationships change, we can really get out of this really very politically tense relationship much more easily than many would assume. I hope I'm right on this. None of this means that there are no challenges that are actually objective, because the world has changed. The world has changed. Our priorities in the Middle East has changed. Our priorities in the globe have changed. Theirs themselves, their priorities and their interests have changed. But now it's a matter of figuring out that common ground that you mentioned before, where we could still be together and address those challenges collectively in ways like, frankly, we've never done before, at least effectively and efficiently, right? How can we learn to do more with less? Because you're right, the trend for us is to move more and more assets, personnel, equipment from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. And so this is why this issue of integration, this is why this issue of multilateralism, this is why this issue of working together becomes so paramount, because now you've got a little bit less stuff to work with, but that does not mean that you could be less effective. You could be as effective, if not more effective and more efficient and economical if you pursue this integration piece well. And that should be the core message, once again, as I mentioned before, of President Biden to the region. We'll still serve as a facilitator. We'll still serve as a hub. We will still serve as an enabler on various initiatives, and hopefully with a little bit more political leadership, which I have yet to see, and a little bit more of a robust diplomatic effort. But it has to be messaged much more effectively. The messaging has been awful, frankly. It's too bad because on the military side of things, there is so much going on. And I know that from my friends and former colleagues at CENTCOM, a number of initiatives that are taking place across domains. All they require is some kind of a push from political leadership, from the White House, from the Pentagon, from the State Department. They are ready, they're moving along, they are progressing, they are pursuing a set of activities that would get us into higher levels of integration in multiple domains, at sea, in the air, on the ground, functional, procedural aspects of integration, doctrines, training, all of that is now very well organized in US Central Command. What it needs to really have a higher level of tempo of implementation, what it needs is this political push, is this diplomatic push from the president, and I hope that they get it because they are ready.
Re-elaborating a bit on many insights that you share with us now about how to define an effective military power. I mean, having a full spectrum force gathering armed forces, land forces, air forces, the Navy, or having, top-notch quality task forces in anti-terrorism or air warfare, and about the fact that a massive hard power capabilities do not mean having effectual combat efficiency on the ground. There is a huge gap to fill in that. And you say also that in general, the way of doing warfare has dramatically changed and at very fast pace, especially during the last 20 decades. So reading the book, there is this sense that there is not a direct proportional relationship between the amount of lethal and modern weapons transferred to partners and the effective combat readiness, as well as military capabilities of the troops that actually have this very effective weapon system. So And you continue to remember the reader about the synchrony that should be upheld between societies, bureaucracies, and militaries, and the need to stop to prioritize the possession of equipment and to focus on a better work, a better coordination between human, strategic, and technological systems. So in this transition, in this era that is moving away from the conventional warfare that was known in the past, how the countries, both the United States and the Arab partner, should behave in order to not be blindsided by the very promising effectiveness of, drones, but also I'm thinking about Task Force 59 with the use of, drones for surveillance of the Gulf and the Red Sea. So how we could and we should integrate these massive achievements on the technological side with a massive push forward and significant and meaningful push forward on the human and strategic aspect.
Well, that is a ginormous question, Leonardo, and I'm not sure I can answer it in the next couple minutes. This requires hours and hours, but let me just give you some brief bullet points that hopefully will be useful to the audience. You are absolutely correct that we live in a very different age when it comes to warfare, with artificial intelligence, with unmanned systems, and so on and so forth. And those are not theoretical now propositions. They're actually being live tested, used in combat, whether it's in conventional settings, whether it's in assassinations, whether it's in lower intensity conflicts, you name it. So the advent of unmanned warfare has actually arrived. It's actually here. That said, you still need a human factor. You still need human capital to know when to shoot, and equally important, when not to shoot. You need trained personnel. You need educated personnel. You need strategists. You need planners. You need people who understand doctrine, who know how to formulate doctrine, who know how to actually train others, train the trainer, essentially. All this universe of what we call human resource management will never be lose its significance despite the technological trends that we are witnessing today. At the end of the day, at the very core of any military is the soldier. It is not the equipment, it is the soldier. I just remembered actually a quote from Maverick. I don't know if you've seen the last Maverick, Leonardo, but it's not the fighter jet, it's the pilot. And that's very true. That is very true. At the end of the day, you need someone who's highly knowledgeable with a high IQ, highly trained, in order to use increasingly sophisticated weapons, some of which are easier to use now because, again, of the technology, but you still need someone to know when to use it, when not to use it, and when to integrate it, and how to integrate it, and how to sustain it, right? And so the human factor will always be critical, no matter what. And especially on the ground, and at sea. You can get away with a little bit of imperfections, in air power if you're actually doing, standoff munitions, right, and firing from faraway places. But not on the ground where, combat is much closer, and certainly not at sea, okay? This is the Achilles heel of all Arab militaries, which is this issue of human resource management. How do you recruit people? How do you reward them? How do you fire them? Those underachievers, what do you do with them? Those excellent performers, what do you do with them? How do you incentivize them? How do you make the career in the military actually more exciting for people as opposed to go and work in the oil sector or private sector or something else? How do you integrate your own organizations? Like, for example, there are some organizations, or if you want to call them units, within certain Arab militaries that are completely separate. Saudi Arabian National Guard is a very separate entity from the Saudi General Armed Forces, right? And there are several examples of that in other places. But if you ask me to put my finger on the one thing that you really need in this day and age, in this 21st century, to become not just an effective military power, but also an exciting and attractive partner to the United States, is this ability to achieve jointness, okay? Because if you're going to be interoperable with the United States, which means that you're going to fight with them in a coalition mode, it's not just about equipment. It's also about joint warfighting concepts. It's also about being at sync, strategically speaking, in terms of doctrines, in terms of actually how to fight, how to approach war. How do you actually achieve higher levels of readiness? How do you invest in phase zero? Phase zero meaning steady state operations, right? So there's no conflict, you're at peace, and yet you are working very hard 24/7 to improve your readiness levels. Because when the bullets start flying and you recognize that your readiness level is awful, then you know what's going to happen at war, right? You're not going to be prepared. That is a huge problem for all Arab militaries. They do not invest sufficiently in what we call in the US military phase zero. And this is what we can help them with. Educate them on certain processes, intellectual, procedural, technical, institutional, on how to actually become a more better prepared, a readier force, so that when the contingency does arise, when a crisis does arise, they are ready for it. Of course, with our help linking in, if we're going to be interoperable. People talk about interoperability as if it's just matchy, weapon systems. Oh, we've got Super Hornets, they've got Super Hornets, let's go to war together. No, it's a whole lot more than that. It's a whole lot more than that. There's a lot of strategic thinking concepts, joint warfighting concepts, all of those things. How do you approach war at the strategic level that have to be also included into this conversation of interoperability? And we just don't have enough of those things with the Arab military.
Exactly. We have just less than 10 minutes to our discussion. And I know that the question that I'm going to present to you is kind of big, but if you can just present your view and your perspective. Last November, you published a piece titled Integrated Air and Missile Defense will Enhance Security in the Middle East with the National Interest. And you shed light on the fact that a Gulf Integrated Air Defense Missile Program is all but a new proposal. Right. And no real effort was made in the past decades to turn this wishful thinking into something tangible and effective. And actually, during the past weeks, this issue has eaten the headlines all over the world about this not well-defined pact or defense alliance between the United States, Arab Gulf countries, Egypt and Jordan, plus Israel. So from your perspective, are there the conducive conditions and the genuine political will to bring about a different outcome from the past failures? And how could a US-led defense institutional building program contribute to the establishment of a meaningful air defense pact?
So the conditions certainly are far more conducive today for a couple of reasons. One, these countries are under attack, okay? If there's any time where we're going to be pursuing this initiative, it is right now, because the sense of urgency is pretty high, right? Before it was, a nice thing to have, kind of like a deterrent, but there were no attacks, physical attacks against critical infrastructure, oil refineries, water desalination plants, and so on and so forth. Now they're actually being attacked, and our own facilities are being attacked as well, right? US embassies, military bases, so on and so forth. So that sense of urgency hopefully should make this a little bit more likely to happen. There is also the factor of incorporating the Israelis, who, because of the normalization accords with the Bahrainis and the Moroccans and the Emiratis, they can play a very interesting role in this because they have certain technologies that could be quite helpful to the Gulf states, especially on shorter range air missile defense, right? The political crisis that was happening for many years amongst Gulf countries and that embargo against the Qataris, and on the one side you had the Egyptians, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis against the Qataris, that crisis has drastically subsided, right? I don't want to say it's completely gone. Okay, there's still some jealousies, rivalries, you name it, whatever, but it's nothing like what it was before. Okay, the atmosphere is a whole lot better, and it's far more conducive to actually at least discussing cooperation on air missile defense. So yes, to answer your question, this is a much better time, but it comes back to the question of how far are they actually going to go? Is it going to be limited just to sharing intelligence and sharing information? Or is it going to be also agreements of not just that, but also intercepting missiles that might not be heading at me, but I might be heading at actually another country or a neighboring country. So what we call national fire control systems, right? So look, as far as we're concerned, the United States, we've been ready since day one. We can be the hub, we can play the role of the hub, we can be the integrator, we can be the one working on the shared early warning system with them and creating a network for everybody so that they all have the same picture, right? But this first and foremost requires their own cooperation and their own trust. And if we have to build this gradually, that's no problem at all. It doesn't have to all happen in the first few weeks or few months. Maybe start with countries that seem to be a little bit more like-minded or that have better relations amongst themselves, whether it's the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, and then move on to incorporate others. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as ultimately it is as inclusive, as multilateral as possible.
Exactly. How a couple of weeks ago, King Abdullah II of Jordan said, when actually endorsing the idea of NATO in the Middle East, he said that ultimately at the end of the day, everything comes back to how we define the mandate of a potential alliance and pact. So in order to wrap up our session, I would like to invite you to make other potential remarks or few comments on the Biden visit, or there are issues that we were not able to cover during our talk. So feel free to mention other issues. Otherwise, we could even close our meeting today.
Just very quickly, Leonardo, first of all, again, huge thanks to Trends for giving me the opportunity to discuss a little bit my book with you, Leonardo, and all the really excellent questions, difficult questions that you asked me, which should be asked about this trip. But I just want to remind the audience one more time that the president is meeting with a number of countries. This is not just with Saudi Arabia, okay? And each one has its own file, has its own list of grievances and preferences with the United States. And so it's going to be quite a challenge for the administration to address all concerns and respond to all wishes. And as always, this is nothing, unusual or surprising. As always, the bilateral tracks are going to be predominant. They're going to come first and foremost, hopefully not at the expense of the multilateral stuff, but first and foremost, it's got to be bilateral stuff. The Emiratis are going to look for what kind of agreements they can sign with the Americans. Same with the Bahrainis, same with the Qataris. Everybody's going to look for their own stuff bilaterally with the United States. And Biden's message, I hope, and challenge is going to be, okay, we get it. We have bilateral relations with every single one of you. Can we please work a little bit harder on this issue of integration, on this issue of multilateralism across domains, because that's what we need to do. That is the strategy moving forward in order to address common challenges and secure collective interests.
Thank you so much. So before closing the session, I would like, first thing first, thank Mr. Bilal for being with us today, presenting the book and covering the Biden visit to the Middle East. And I would like also to thank our audience for being with us. And I invite you to buy and read the book of Mr. Bilal, because it's not just an analysis, it's also a pragmatical tool, but at the same time, ideational tool of how things should be done from now on in the relationship between the United States and the Arab partners. So thank you very much.
Leonardo, a piece of advice to the audience, whoever is listening, don't buy the book off Amazon because the price on Amazon is like $95, which is absolutely nuts. On the Lynn Reiner website, which is my publisher, they have a 50% discount, which gets it down to $47.50, which is much more digestible than $95 on Amazon. So just my own piece of advice. That's all.
That's the way I bought it actually. So
You're a smart man.
thank you very much to everybody for joining us, and stay tuned for other events organized by Trends. Thank you very much.